It's 2:17 in the morning. You're asleep. And 70 miles off the coast of Oregon, a fault line that has been locked in place for over 300 years, finally lets go. In the next 90 seconds, before most people even wake up, a chain of failures is going to start. Power, communication, roads, hospitals, one after another, in a specific order. And because it's the middle of the night, almost none of the systems that would normally help you are going to work the way you expect. This video isn't about whether the Cascadia earthquake happens. Scientists agree it will. This video is about something almost nobody talks about: what changes when it happens in the dark. And by the end, you're going to understand exactly what fails first, second, and third, and why the same earthquake at 2 a.m. instead of 2 p.m. could be a completely different disaster. Before we go further, let's ground this in real science, because this isn't speculation. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is a fault line running roughly 700 miles along the Pacific coast, from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia. It sits offshore, where the Juan de Fuca plate is slowly being forced underneath the North American plate. And it is right now locked, meaning the two plates are stuck together, building up stress instead of sliding smoothly. The last time this fault fully ruptured was January 26, 1700. Geological evidence, layers of sand deposited by tsunamis, drowned forests, and even Japanese written records of a tsunami arriving with no earthquake felt locally, tells us that the quake was somewhere around magnitude 9.0. Researchers estimate this kind of full margin rupture happens roughly every 500 years on average, with smaller partial ruptures more frequently. We are already past the 3-century mark since the last one, so this isn't a hypothetical monster. It's a documented, historical, repeating event that we are geologically overdue for. And in this video, we're going to walk through what emergency planners actually expect to fail, and in what order, specifically in a nighttime scenario, because darkness changes almost everything about how this event unfolds. When a magnitude 9.0 Cascadia rupture happens, it isn't a quick jolt like most earthquakes people are used to. Subduction zone earthquakes like this one can produce strong shaking for 3 to 5 minutes or more, compared to just seconds for a typical shallow fault earthquake. That alone is one of the most dangerous parts of this scenario. It's not a jolt you brace through. It's minutes of sustained, rolling, escalating shaking that slowly grinds down anything not built to handle it. Now here's the first thing that fails, and it fails almost immediately: the power grid. Substations, transformers, and transmission towers across the region are not built to withstand minutes of intense shaking, combined with widespread ground failure. Within the first few minutes, large sections of the electrical grid across Oregon and Washington are expected to go down. And here's the part that matters specifically because it's nighttime. There are no street lights, no porch lights, no illuminated exit signs, no glow from a nearby gas station. The moment the shaking stops, you're not just dealing with a disaster. You're dealing with a disaster in complete darkness, in a neighborhood you suddenly don't recognize because every familiar visual cue is gone. The second failure, happening almost in parallel with the power grid, is communication. Cell towers are designed with backup battery power, but those batteries are only built to last a matter of hours. Some estimates put it at 4 to 8 hours before towers without generator support go silent. In a daytime earthquake, you'd have a window where texts and calls might still get through while backup batteries hold on. At 2 a.m., that battery window burns through while most of the region is still asleep, unaware that anything has happened, and unable to check on family members the moment they wake up, because the network is already failing. Think about what that means practically. Your phone has no signal. You can't call 911, not because you don't want to, but because the tower serving your neighborhood has already gone dark. You can't check a map for the safest route out. You can't see a single news alert. Every piece of information you're used to having instantly at 2 a.m. after a magnitude 9 earthquake simply isn't there. The third failure is structural, and this is where the nighttime factor becomes genuinely life or death rather than just inconvenient. During the day, a large percentage of the population is at work, in cars, or out in public spaces, many of which, especially newer commercial buildings, are built to more modern seismic codes. At night, the overwhelming majority of people are home, asleep, inside residential buildings, and a significant number of older homes and apartment buildings across the Pacific Northwest, particularly older unreinforced masonry structures, were built decades before modern seismic retrofitting standards existed. That means the population is concentrated at the moment of maximum shaking, inside the buildings statistically most likely to sustain serious structural damage, and they're asleep, unable to get up and brace themselves, unable to get under a doorway or table in time, in the dark, disoriented, with alarms and sirens that may or may not still have power to sound. Think about your own bedroom for a second. In broad daylight, if the ground started shaking, you'd instinctively look around, spot the doorway, see the table you could get under, see the window you'd want to stay away from. At 2 a.m., in a room you know well but can no longer see, disorientation itself becomes a hazard. People fall while reaching for light switches that don't work. People cut their feet on broken glass they can't see on the floor. People waste critical seconds simply figuring out which direction the bedroom door actually is, because the shaking has already knocked over the furniture they'd normally use to orient themselves. None of this shows up in a magnitude number or a damage estimate. But emergency responders who've studied nighttime disaster scenarios in other parts of the world consistently note that basic orientation and mobility, something we take completely for granted with the lights on, becomes a genuine survival factor once you remove them. Add to this the fact that older residential buildings across the Pacific Northwest, many of them multi-story apartment buildings with ground-floor parking or soft-story construction, are known seismic risks that numerous cities have flagged for retrofitting programs. Programs that, in many cases, are still incomplete. At night, these are precisely the buildings with the highest occupancy, because that's when people are home. So within the first 2 to 3 minutes of this event, before help has even begun mobilizing, you already have 3 simultaneous cascading failures. No power, degrading communication, and a population caught in the most vulnerable possible position, in the dark. And we haven't even gotten to the roads yet, or the tsunami, which, if you live anywhere near the coast, is the part of this video you genuinely need to hear. Because if you think losing power and phone service is the worst part of this, we haven't gotten to the part where entire coastal towns have less than 15 minutes to evacuate, in the dark, over roads and bridges that may no longer exist. Let's talk about what happens to the roads, because this is where nighttime evacuation becomes a genuinely different problem than a daytime one. Emergency planning documents for the region are blunt about this. Bridges are critical not just for emergency response after the earthquake, but for evacuation during it, especially along the coast, where getting to higher ground quickly is the only real defense against the tsunami. Multiple coastal bridges and overpasses across Oregon and Washington are older structures, and modeling of a magnitude 9 Cascadia event shows that structural collapse of thousands of buildings and a significant number of bridges is expected across the hardest-hit counties. Here's the nighttime twist that most disaster coverage skips entirely. During the day, there's more traffic on these roads, meaning more potential for people to be caught on a collapsing bridge. But there's also more visibility, more awareness, and more people already positioned to help each other navigate around damage. At night, There are fewer vehicles on the road when the quake hits, but the moment evacuation begins, that same darkness that reduced immediate bridge casualties now becomes the biggest obstacle to escape. You cannot see if a bridge deck has dropped 6 inches, or if a section of coastal highway has liquefied into unstable ground, or if a landslide has covered the road you were planning to take, until your headlights hit it, possibly too late to stop. And soil liquefaction makes this dramatically worse. When loose, water-saturated soil gets shaken intensely for minutes at a time. It temporarily behaves less like solid ground and more like thick liquid. Roads buckle. Underground pipes fracture. Buildings built on this kind of ground can tilt or sink. A study modeling liquefaction risk across roughly 400 locations in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia found that liquefaction in a magnitude 9 scenario could be widespread, damaging infrastructure across a huge stretch of the region. And Portland, notably, sits on extensive river sediment, while parts of Seattle are built on fill. Both cities carry an outsized risk from this specific hazard. Now, layer the tsunami on top of all of this. For coastal residents, here's the actual timeline scientists use. The earthquake itself is the warning. There will likely be no siren, no official alert reaching you before the water arrives, because the tsunami can begin arriving in as little as 15 to 20 minutes for the closest coastal communities. Official guidance is consistent and blunt. When the shaking stops, that is your cue to move to high ground immediately, on foot if needed, without waiting for confirmation. Now imagine doing that at 2 a.m. No streetlights, no power in your home to find shoes, a flashlight, or your phone charger. No working cell signal to check a tsunami evacuation map you may have never actually looked at before tonight. Roads that may be cracked, blocked by landslide debris, or missing sections entirely from bridge damage. And you have roughly 15 minutes to get from sea level to high ground, through all of that, in total darkness, while the ground is still trembling with aftershocks. This is why emergency planners in Oregon specifically use the phrase, "be 2 weeks ready." Because current estimates suggest that with the region's present infrastructure and preparedness levels, some coastal areas could be cut off from outside help for 2 weeks or longer. Landslides, liquefaction, and damaged bridges are expected to isolate certain coastal communities into what planners literally call islands, pockets of population that cannot be reached by road until infrastructure is repaired or alternate routes, often by air or sea, are established. It's worth pausing here to compare this to what actually happened in 1700, because we have real historical evidence, not just modeling. Japanese coastal villages, thousands of miles across the Pacific, recorded a tsunami arriving with no earthquake felt beforehand, what Japanese records at the time called an orphan tsunami, because there was no local shaking to explain where it came from. Researchers were later able to match the timing of that tsunami precisely to a Cascadia rupture on January 26, 1700, using tree ring dating of drowned coastal forests on the Washington and Oregon coastline. Entire groves of cedar trees killed almost instantly when the coastline dropped several feet and salt water flooded in. That single piece of evidence tells us 2 things. The fault genuinely does rupture at this scale, and when it does, the tsunami is powerful enough to cross an entire ocean and still register as a significant wave on the other side. Now bring that back to a nighttime evacuation happening today, with modern coastal populations that didn't exist in 1700. Entire towns like Seaside, Long Beach, and Ocean Shores sit directly in tsunami inundation zones, often with a single main evacuation route inland. During planned daytime drills, these evacuations are already tight on time, even with clear visibility and full awareness of the plan. At night, with no power, no working phones, and roads potentially compromised by the earthquake itself, that same evacuation route becomes the single most critical piece of infrastructure in the entire region. And it's exactly the kind of infrastructure most likely to be damaged by the earthquake that triggered the tsunami in the first place. So by this point in our timeline, just minutes after the shaking stops, you have a region with no power, degrading cell service, a population caught inside vulnerable buildings in the dark, roads that may be impassable, and a tsunami clock already running out for coastal residents who may not even have working information to know they need to move. But there's one more failure point that determines how many of the injured actually survive what comes next. And it's the one hospitals have been quietly worried about for years. Because even if you make it through the shaking, even if you get to high ground in time, the hospitals that are supposed to treat the injured are facing their own countdown clock. And at night, that clock is shorter than almost anyone realizes. Hospitals across the Pacific Northwest are required to have backup generators, and most do. But backup power is not the same as normal operations. Generators are built to run critical systems: ventilators, operating rooms, refrigeration for medication and blood supply, not entire hospital campuses at full capacity. Fuel supplies for those generators are typically sized for a matter of days, not weeks, and resupply depends entirely on roads that, as we just covered, may be partially or fully impassable across large parts of the region. At night specifically, hospitals are already operating with reduced staffing compared to daytime shifts. A mass casualty event that would already stretch a fully staffed daytime hospital to its limits becomes exponentially harder to manage with a smaller overnight team, many of whom are also dealing with their own damaged homes and families they can't immediately reach because, again, the phones aren't working. Emergency response modeling for a magnitude 9. Cascadia event projects that in the hardest-hit counties, areas like Grays Harbor, Pacific, and parts of King County, regional functionality, meaning the ability of infrastructure and services to operate normally, could initially drop as low as 12%. That's not a minor disruption. That's a near-total collapse of normal operating capacity across some of the most populated parts of the region, all at once, with the injury numbers from a magnitude 9 event, including thousands of people requiring hospitalization and, tragically, expected fatalities in the thousands as well, depending on the specific rupture scenario and time of day. Consider what a 12% functionality number actually means for someone injured at 2 a.m. It means the nearest hospital may not be reachable by road. It means the hospital that is reachable may already be over capacity with people who arrive before you. It means ambulance response times, which are already stretched thin during a mass casualty event, are further slowed by exactly the road damage and darkness we've already covered. Triage systems that hospitals train for assume a functioning supply chain behind them. More staff arriving for the next shift, more fuel for generators, more medical supplies delivered by truck. In this scenario, the supply chain is one of the first things to break, and it doesn't come back in hours. It comes back in days, and in the hardest-hit coastal counties, potentially in weeks. Now, here's the honest, complete picture, because context matters as much as the scary numbers. Emergency management agencies across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia are not caught off guard by any of this. This scenario has been modeled extensively. The U.S. Geological Survey maintains detailed ShakeMap scenarios specifically for a magnitude 9 Cascadia rupture, built from dozens of different rupture models to understand exactly which areas face which risks. States run large-scale earthquake response exercises, like the Cascadia Rising drills, specifically to stress test coordination between agencies before a real event ever happens. None of this is a surprise to the people whose job is to plan for it. What's also true is that current estimates put the probability of a magnitude 7.1 or larger rupture on this fault at roughly 37% over the next 50 years. Significant, but not a certainty on any specific date. And notably, that figure covers partial ruptures as well as the full magnitude 9 worst-case scenario we've focused on in this video. Not every future Cascadia earthquake will be the maximum version we've just walked through. So let's bring this back together, because the point of this video was never to scare you. It was to answer one specific question honestly. What actually fails first, and why does nighttime make it different? The order is consistent across almost every model. Power grid first, within minutes. Cellular communication next, degrading over hours as backup batteries drain. Structural failures happen simultaneously with the shaking itself, disproportionately affecting residential buildings where, at night, the population is concentrated and asleep. Roads and bridges were compromised by both direct damage and liquefaction, cutting off both evacuation and emergency response routes at exactly the moment they're needed most. And hospitals, even with generators and planning, are facing a capacity collapse that daytime staffing levels and daylight visibility would have at least partially softened. Nighttime doesn't just make this earthquake scarier. It removes, one by one, almost every advantage that daylight and normal infrastructure would otherwise give you. Visibility, communication, staffing, and the simple ability to see where the danger actually is. Here's what we know, stated plainly. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is real, it's locked, it's overdue by historical averages, and scientists are not debating whether it will rupture again, only when. When it does, the first systems to fail will be power and communication, within minutes. Coastal residents will have as little as 15 minutes to reach high ground, using the earthquake itself as the only warning they'll get. Bridges and roads across the region face a real risk of collapse or impassability from both direct shaking and soil liquefaction. And hospitals, even with generators and years of planning, will be operating in a capacity collapse that could initially leave the hardest-hit areas functioning at a fraction of normal capacity. If this happens at night, every one of those failures is compounded by darkness, reduced staffing, and a population caught asleep at the exact moment maximum preparedness would matter most. We're going to keep covering real science-based disaster scenarios like this one, not for shock value, but because understanding exactly what fails and in what order is the difference between freezing when it happens and already knowing what to do. Knowing that power and cell service fail first means you can keep a charged battery pack and a physical printed evacuation map. Somewhere you can find it in the dark. Knowing that bridges and roads are the weak point means you can identify right now more than one possible route to high ground from wherever you sleep. Knowing the tsunami clock is 15 minutes, not 15 hours, means the earthquake itself has to be your only warning. Not a phone alert, not a siren, not a knock on the door. If this video helped you understand the real timeline of a Cascadia rupture, hit subscribe, because we're continuing this series with a full breakdown of what actual preparedness looks like for people living in this region. And if you want to understand how this same fault connects to the earthquake activity we've already seen this year across Venezuela, California, and the Ring of Fire, go check out our previous video next. It lays the groundwork for exactly why scientists are watching this region so closely right now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.